are 3 weeks out, which means 1 week closer to the BMF title. And that match keeps on getting more interesting, and the line on that keeps on changing, right? Diaz came in with a head full of steam, and then some people kind of thought about it and go, well, wait just a second. I'm going to put some money on Masvidal. Then Masvidal went to a favorite. Then Masvidal went to a big favorite of 2.5 to 1, and now they're back down to Masvidal, still the favorite, but I mean, it might as well be even money. If you're won anything for me, right, if you don't reach the 2 to 2.5 to 3, if you're won anything, you're even money. For me, for colloquial terms. But that is an interesting content. Here, let me ask you guys a question as you look at this fight, okay? First off, who does 5 rounds favor? You decide, but you need to factor that in because it's going to be 5. Secondly, if I was to ask you the question like this, Jorge Masvidal versus Nate Diaz, the best Jorge Masvidal you've ever seen versus the best Nate Diaz you've ever seen. Who wins that fight? Pause. Think about that. Masvidal at his absolute prime, Diaz at his absolute prime. Think about the question. Think about what your answer would be. But now let me ask you it in a second way, okay? Jorge Masvidal that you saw last, so against Askren, versus Nate Diaz that you saw last versus Pettis, because that changes what your response would be. The belief in Jorge Masvidal has been quickly on the rise, and frankly, it's a slow build. He deserves a lot more credit than he's been given over his career. He's getting it now, but he's deserved a lot more a lot sooner. But that was a major coming out party. I mean, now there was talk of world championship fights. And not only that, there was talk that he could win the world championship, which is a discussion and a belief that I have personally held for a meaningful period of time. But now it's starting to circulate throughout the masses. Fair? Okay. Back up on Nate Diaz's fight with Pettis. It was believed that his best days were behind him. That was believed, and possibly even by him, and definitely supported with evidence that he had been out for 3 years. And I think he was batting .500 over the last meaningful period of fight. So if you wanted to make that claim, you could. And you could support it logically. But would you agree with me when I tell you the best Nate Diaz I've ever seen is the one that I just saw versus Anthony Pettis? Would you agree with me on that? This is a guy who'd been out for 3 years, who was having a hard time figuring out what weight he wanted to go, between 55 and 70, who looked as though maybe he was never going to come back, which tells us, well, maybe he doesn't really love the sport anymore, and this is a really hard thing to do if you don't love it. Oh, and by the way, he's in there with a world champion who used to be on the cover of the Wheaties box. I mean, Anthony Pettis, not for nothing, Anthony Pettis is nobody's fool and has never been treated or acted like anybody's fool. The guy just had a knockdown drag-out with Tony Ferguson. I mean, Anthony Pettis is not... And Nate didn't have a problem with him. He just didn't. That's just what happened. Nate won all 3 rounds. That's just what happened. He outpaced him, he outconditioned him, he walked him down. That's just simply what happened. If you factor that in with the fact that maybe I'm still right, maybe both things are right, maybe the statement that was not Nate at his best, and that was the best we've ever seen Nate look. If you factor those in together and you realize that both statements might be true, then it does make you wonder what in the hell is an unrusty Nate Diaz, who, by the way, I'll answer the first question I asked you guys, which was who does a 5-round fight favor? I can at least tell you that Nate would prefer a 5-round fight. Can he outpace and out-hustle Masvidal? Well, they're going to have to go fight to figure that one out for sure. But Nate would at least prefer that it was 5 rounds. So what if both statements are true? What if Nate Diaz is currently fighting at his highest level? Oh, and by the way, he's doing that while rusty. Oh, and I think we can logically assume he won't be quite as rusty in this next one. What if that's true? I don't know that it is. But I know from the evidence that we're sitting back and observing, it certainly could be. It makes things a little bit more interesting. And by the way, when you do talk about 170 pounds, that isn't just Nate Diaz that's adjusting that. Jorge Masvidal is growing quite nicely into the weight class. He's seen a little bit more pep in his step. He's seen a little bit more energy. I mean, he's going rounds each day, and whether they got a beef right now or not, but him and Colby Covington, and Colby won himself a world championship, Masvidal knows where he stands, and whether he shared that with the rest of them or not, he knows. Oh, and by the way, I should mention Lawler held that same title, and Masvidal's got a hold of him every day to know where he stands. And should I mention, Tyron Woodley had that same 170-pound title. Masvidal's teammates with it. He knows where he stands, and he's adjusting to this weight class. I think there is a very common, sensical argument that both of these guys will bring into the cage, one with Diaz getting a little rust off his back, but two, the other side of the story that's not told, that Masvidal is now adjusting to the welterweight class. I think it's reasonable to believe each athlete is going to put on a performance better than we've ever seen them put on before. And if you're trying to bet on this fight and you're trying to look smart to your buddies and you're basing it on past performances, I would only suggest for you, it is highly likely that both of these guys come in sharper, crisper, hungrier, more fit with more on the line than we have ever seen before.
Uncle Chael, there's no bad guy like Uncle Chael. Never lost, not even around. Undefeated, undisputed, oh yeah.